I was 19 when I worked the concession stand at Lake Sammamish State Park that summer. It was my second season there, and I'd gotten comfortable with the routine, the families spreading out their blankets by 10 in the morning, the smell of sunscreen and charcoal, the steady line for hot dogs and sodas that lasted from noon until the sun started to drop behind the trees. July 14th was a Sunday. I remember because the Rainier Beer Company had their annual picnic that day, and we'd been warned to stock extra ice. What if that was him? What if he asked them the same thing he asked me? A sketch went up a week later. Police were looking for a man who called himself Ted, mid-20s, brown hair, neat appearance, driving a tan or brown Volkswagen Beetle. Several women had reported him asking for help with a sailboat. He'd been wearing his arm in a sling. The sketch showed a regular-looking guy, handsome even, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. I thought about Jenny immediately. I found her during our lunch break and asked if she'd talked to the police. She had. She'd given them a description. She kept saying she felt lucky she'd been working, that she couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if she hadn't been. He was so normal, she said. That's what I can't get over. He didn't seem dangerous at all. He seemed like the kind of guy who'd actually need help. I started thinking about that, about how many times I'd helped people that summer without thinking twice. How automatic it was to say yes when someone asked for directions or assistance. How it never occurred to me that someone might lie about needing help. The investigation stretched into August. Hundreds of tips came in. They released the composite sketch to the news, and suddenly everyone was looking at every brown-haired man in every Volkswagen. I started seeing them everywhere, in the parking lot, at the gas station on my way home. One pulled up next to me at a red light once, and I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel until the light changed and he turned off in a different direction. My mother asked me once if I wanted to quit the job. We were sitting at dinner, and she'd been watching me push food around my plate for 10 minutes. I told her I was fine. I needed the money for school in the fall. But the truth was I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling, that the park had become a place where I was constantly aware of exits and sightlines and who was standing too close. One afternoon in late August, a family came through my line. The mother ordered hot dogs for her kids, and while I was getting them ready, her daughter, maybe 7 years old, wandered off toward the tree line. Just a few feet, not far, but the mother's voice when she called her back made everyone nearby turn and look, sharp, panicked. The little girl came running back, confused, and her mother grabbed her hand so hard the girl started crying. I handed over the hot dogs without saying anything. The mother's hands were shaking when she took them. September 6th was a Saturday. I wasn't working. I heard about it on the news that night, sitting in my parents' living room with a plate of dinner I couldn't finish. 2 grouse hunters had found remains near Issaquah, not far from the park. Skeletal remains, the reporter said, in a wooded area off a service road. The reporter didn't give details beyond that, but they didn't need to. I already knew. They confirmed it a few days later, Janice and Denise, and a third set of remains that belonged to a girl who'd gone missing in June before I'd even started my summer job. Her name was Jorgen Hawkins, 18 years old, a student at the University of Washington. All of them found in the same area, scattered in the underbrush like something discarded. I kept working at the park through the end of September when the season ended. I needed the money, and I told myself it was fine, that he was probably long gone. But I started parking closer to the building. I stopped taking breaks alone. I watched people more carefully than I used to. The way they moved through the park, who they talked to, whether they seemed like they belonged. There was a moment about 2 weeks before the season ended when a man approached my stand and I felt my stomach drop. He was the right age, the right look. He smiled at me and asked what kind of sandwiches we had, and I heard my voice answer him automatically while my brain screamed at me to look at his hands, his car, whether anyone was watching. He bought a sandwich and a Coke and thanked me and walked away. And I stood there feeling ridiculous and terrified at the same time. Jenny quit 3 days before the end of the season. Didn't give notice. Just didn't show up for her shift. My manager said she'd called and told him she couldn't come back. I tried calling her once, but she didn't answer. I didn't try again. The worst part was realizing he'd been there in the middle of the day, surrounded by thousands of people, and no one had stopped him. He'd walked through the crowd like he belonged. He'd smiled and made conversation and asked for help, and because he looked right, because he seemed normal and injured and harmless, women had believed him. Some had even gone with him partway before something made them turn back, some instinct or coincidence that saved their lives. I thought about that a lot, about what made them turn back and what made Janice and Denise keep going, if it was instinct or luck or just the wrong moment of trust. The temperature hit somewhere between 80 and 90 degrees, which for Washington felt like a gift, the kind of day that made people forget we lived in a place where it rained more often than not. The parking lot filled before I even clocked in. My manager estimated maybe 40,000 people showed up. The beach was shoulder to shoulder with towels and umbrellas. I didn't see the man with the sling at first. I heard about him later from Jenny, who worked the rental booth near the boat launch. If I would have helped him if he'd asked me on a different day when I wasn't behind the counter. If I'd been the one walking to the restroom or lying on a towel near the beach. They caught him eventually, years later in a different state, after he'd killed so many more. I read about the trial and the confessions and the photographs they showed in court. His name was Ted Bundy. He'd been a law student. Volunteers had worked on his political campaigns. People who knew him described him as charming and intelligent. His own girlfriend had turned him in, and the police had dismissed it because he seemed too normal to be dangerous. There was one picture I remember seeing in a newspaper shot taken by a tourist at Lake Sammamish that day. You could see the parking lot and the beach in the background, and there, in one of the parking spaces, you could see his car. You could see him sitting inside it, just barely visible through the windshield. He was watching the crowd. I don't work at the park anymore. Haven't been back since that summer, actually. But I drive past it sometimes on my way to Seattle, and I always look at the parking lot when I do. It's almost never empty. There are always cars there, families heading to the beach, people looking for a nice place to spend the afternoon. I wonder sometimes if they know what happened there, if they've heard the story or if it's just another park to them. Another beautiful place on a sunny day. I hope they're careful. I hope they pay attention to the people around them. I hope they trust that feeling when something doesn't seem right, even when the person asking for help looks exactly like someone who deserves it. Because I learned that summer that danger doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks like a nice young man with an injured arm who just needs a hand with his sailboat. Sometimes it's polite and smiling and says no problem when you tell them no. And sometimes 40,000 people can be watching and still not see it coming. She mentioned it casually during our break, sitting on the back steps of the equipment shed where we'd go to get away from the crowds. She was eating an apple and watching the lake, and she said a guy had asked her to help him with his sailboat. Really polite, she said. Good looking. Had his arm in a sling. What'd you tell him? I asked. I told him I was working, she said, shrugging. He just smiled and said no problem. Walked off toward the parking lot. She didn't seem bothered by it. Neither was I. People asked staff for help all the time, directions to the restrooms, where to find the best picnic spots, whether they could rent umbrellas. A guy asking for help with a sailboat seemed perfectly normal on a day when half the state had shown up to enjoy the weather. I didn't think about it again until my shift ended and I saw the commotion near the parking lot. A woman was talking to a park ranger, and I could hear the edge in her voice, even from a distance. Her daughter hadn't come back from the restroom. The ranger was writing something down, nodding, asking questions in that calm way they're trained to do. A small group had gathered nearby, watching. I slowed down as I passed, trying not to stare. By the time I left, there were two families looking for someone. I saw them standing near the ranger station, one family clustered together talking to another ranger, and the first woman I'd seen now sitting on a bench with her face in her hands. I remember thinking it was strange that two people would go missing on the same day, but the park was massive and it was easy to lose track of someone in a crowd that size. People wandered off, got turned around on the trails, lost track of time. I figured they'd turn up. I came back Monday for my shift. The parking lot was half empty, the way it always was on weekdays. But there were more rangers than usual, and I saw a few police cars parked near the main office. My manager pulled me aside before I started, before I'd even tied my apron on. "Did you see anything yesterday?" he asked. "Anyone acting strange? Anyone bothering the guests?" I told him no. He looked tired, older than he had the day before. There were lines around his eyes I hadn't noticed. "2 women didn't come home," he said quietly. "They're searching the woods." The names came out that afternoon. Janice Ann Ott, 23. Denise Marie Nasland, 19. My age. The search went on for days. We'd see the teams heading out in the morning with their dogs and gear, coming back in the evening with nothing. Flyers went up on the bulletin board near the entrance, 2 faces smiling in their photos. Janice looked like someone's sister. Denise looked like someone I could have gone to school with. The park felt different after that. Families still came, but parents kept their kids closer. The beach didn't seem as loud. I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before: men sitting alone in their cars watching. People walking by themselves near the tree line. The way the parking lot looked at dusk, when most people had gone home and the spaces between the remaining cars felt too wide. Jenny stopped taking her breaks outside. She started eating lunch in the storage room instead, sitting on an overturned bucket with the door propped open. I asked her about it once, and she just shook her head. "I keep thinking about him," she said. The guy with the sling. I started driving for a local courier service in 1983. Nothing glamorous, mostly documents between offices, occasional packages that needed same-day delivery. The routes took me all over King County, and I got to know the roads pretty well. Highway 99 was one of my regular runs, especially the stretch south of Seattle near the airport. That's where I first started noticing them. The women would be standing along Pacific Highway South, usually in groups of 2 or 3, sometimes alone. Not weeks or months, but years. Whoever was doing this wasn't stopping, wasn't getting caught. The task force had hundreds of tips and dozens of suspects, but nothing stuck. The news reports started to feel routine: another body found, another family notified, another plea for information. I got married in 1987, had my first kid in 1989, moved to a suburb north of Seattle where the streets were quiet, and the biggest concern was whether the neighbors mowed their lawns often enough. The Green River Killer became background noise, something awful happening somewhere else to people I didn't know. But every so often I'd drive through the old areas for work or to visit friends, and I'd see Highway 99, and I'd remember those women standing on the corners. I'd wonder which ones had made it out and which ones hadn't. The killings seemed to slow down in the late 80s. The task force scaled back. The news coverage decreased. People started to think maybe the killer had died or moved away, or been arrested for something else. The case went cold. Then in 2001, I saw a news alert on my computer at work. Major break in the Green River case. They'd arrested someone. His name was Gary Ridgway, 52 years old, lived in a quiet neighborhood in Auburn, worked as a truck painter at the Kenworth plant in Renton, married, polite, unremarkable in every way except one: his DNA matched evidence from 4 of the earliest victims. I looked at his photograph on the news site. He had thinning hair and a weak chin, and the kind of face you'd forget immediately. He looked like someone's grandfather, like someone you'd see at the grocery store or the hardware store and never think twice about. The trial took 2 years. In 2003, he accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He confessed to 48 murders. Later, he said it might have been more: 70, maybe 80. He told investigators he'd killed so many women he couldn't remember all their names or faces. They'd just blurred together for him. The details that came out during the trial were worse than I'd imagined. He'd been picking up women along Highway 99 for nearly 20 years. He'd show them pictures of his son to gain their trust. He'd strangle them during sex. Then he'd dump their bodies in the woods and come back later weeks or months later to have sex with the corpses. Sometimes he'd move the bodies to different locations to confuse the investigation. Sometimes he'd leave gum or cigarettes at the scene that didn't belong to him. He'd even taken his wife on dates to some of the dump sites, picnics in the woods where bodies were buried nearby. What struck me most was how ordinary his life had seemed. He'd been interviewed by police multiple times over the years. He'd passed a polygraph test. His neighbors described him as quiet and helpful. His coworkers said he was reliable. He'd gone to work every day and come home every night and lived a completely normal life while women disappeared and their families waited for answers. The court proceedings included victim impact statements. Families stood up and talked about their daughters and sisters and mothers. Some of them had been waiting 20 years to know what happened. Some had never stopped looking. One mother talked about how her daughter had called her the night she disappeared, said she was getting a ride from someone and would call back later. She never did. Ridway sat through it all with barely any expression. When he spoke, he was matter-of-fact. He said he targeted prostitutes because they were easy to pick up and no one would miss them right away. He said he'd hated them but also needed them. He said killing them was like a job he couldn't stop doing. They sentenced him to 48 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He's still alive, sitting in a cell at Washington State Penitentiary. Every few years, he'll talk to investigators and lead them to another burial site. In 2023, they identified remains that had been found in 1985, a 15-year-old girl named Lori Ann Raspotnick. She'd been dead for 38 years before her family got an answer. I think about those drives along Highway 99 sometimes, about the women I used to see standing on those corners waiting, about how many of them got into a car with a mild-mannered truck painter who seemed harmless, about the fact that I was driving past them regularly during the same years he was hunting, and I never saw anything wrong. None of us did. The thing that keeps me up sometimes is knowing he's still out there. Not free, but alive. Still breathing. Still eating meals and sleeping and waking up every day. And somewhere in the woods around King County, there are still bodies no one's found yet. Daughters and sisters and mothers who disappeared and never came home. Women whose families are still waiting. He says he wants to help find them. Says he wants to give the families closure. But the investigators who've interviewed him say he's still lying, still manipulating, still trying to maintain some kind of control even from inside a cell. They'd be wearing short skirts and heels even when it was raining, which in Washington meant most of the year. I was 24 and new to the area, and it took me a few weeks to understand what I was seeing. My dispatcher, an older guy named Frank, explained it to me one afternoon when I mentioned the foot traffic. Lot of working girls on that strip, he said, not looking up from his paperwork. Been that way for years. I don't drive Highway 99 much anymore. When I do, I don't see the working girls the way I used to. The area's changed, cleaned up. There are new businesses and development, and the strip doesn't look the same. But I know what happened there. I know that for nearly 20 years, women disappeared from those corners and no one stopped it. That a man with a normal job and a normal life was hunting them while the rest of us drove past without seeing. And I know that somewhere in those woods, the ones I can see from the highway when I'm driving south, there are still secrets buried. Still women who never got to go home. Gary Ridgway is 65 now. He'll die in prison eventually, but the families of his victims, the ones they found and the ones they haven't, they're still living with what he did, still waiting for answers that might never come. I think about that sometimes, about how easy it was for him to hide in plain sight, about how many people probably saw him picking up those women and never thought twice about it because he looked normal, because he looked like everyone else. That's what scares me most. Not that monsters exist, but that they look exactly like the rest of us. You see them, you keep driving. Not our business. So I did. I'd make my deliveries and drive back north, and I'd see the same faces week after week. After a while, I started recognizing some of them. There was a blonde woman who always stood near the same corner by a closed-down gas station. A younger girl, couldn't have been more than 18, who usually worked closer to the motels, an older woman with dark hair who'd wave sometimes when I drove past. Then one week in July, the blonde woman wasn't there. I noticed because her corner looked empty in a way it hadn't before. I figured maybe she'd moved to a different spot, or got arrested, or just decided to take a few days off. I didn't think much about it. But then I started noticing other absences. The younger girl disappeared. Then another woman I'd seen regularly near the bus stop. By August, there were faces I'd gotten used to seeing that just weren't there anymore. I mentioned it to Frank during a slow afternoon at the office. "You notice some of those women on Highway 99 aren't around anymore?" I asked. He shrugged. "They move around, come and go. Probably working a different area." That made sense. I let it go. It was early August when I heard about the first body. I was getting coffee at a diner off Highway 99, and the television above the counter was showing the news. A reporter stood near a river talking about remains that had been found by a couple of kids riding bikes. The Green River, just south of Seattle. The victim was a young woman. They hadn't released her name yet. The waitress refilling my cup shook her head. "Terrible," she said. "Just terrible." 2 days later, they found 3 more bodies in the same area. All young women. All found in or near the Green River within a quarter mile of each other. The news started calling it the Green River Killings. Police formed a task force. The reporters said they were looking for connections between the victims. I thought about the empty corners on Highway 99. By the end of August, they'd found 2 more. The task force held a press conference and released some details. Most of the victims were sex workers who'd been working the SeaTac Strip. They'd all been strangled. They asked anyone with information to come forward. I kept driving my routes. I kept seeing fewer and fewer familiar faces along Pacific Highway South. The ones who were still there looked different, now more nervous, more watchful. Some of them had started working in pairs, staying close together. One afternoon, I saw 3 women get into a car together when usually I'd only seen them go one at a time. The investigation went on for months, then years. Bodies kept turning up in wooded areas off the highway, in parks along rural roads in King County. The numbers kept climbing. 5 victims, 10, 20, 30. Every few months, there'd be another news report about remains found by a jogger or a hiker or someone walking their dog. I changed jobs in 1985, started working in an office downtown. I didn't drive Highway 99 much anymore, but I'd still see the news reports. Still hear about the task force and the investigation and the families waiting for answers. They brought in experts. They consulted with other police departments. They even talked to Ted Bundy in prison, asking him for insight into how the killer might be thinking. Nothing helped. The bodies kept appearing. What bothered me most was how long it went on. I was working the Northwest Orient counter at Portland International Airport on November 24th, 1971. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and the terminal was busy, but not overwhelming. Mostly business travelers trying to get home before the holiday. A few families getting an early start on their trips. The man who bought the ticket to Seattle paid in cash, $20. I remember because most people use credit cards or checks for airline tickets, even back then. Cash was unusual, but not unheard of. The crew felt a sudden change in air pressure and upward motion in the tail. The pilot radioed that he thought their hijacker was gone. F-106 fighter jets that had been scrambling to follow the plane hadn't seen anything. 1 minute he was on board, the next he wasn't. He'd vanished into the night somewhere over the dense forests of southwest Washington. The FBI mobilized immediately. It was one of the biggest manhunts in the agency's history. They called it NORJAK Northwest hijacking. Military troops searched the suspected jump zone. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the wilderness. The Air Force even deployed an SR-71 Blackbird to photograph the entire flight path, though bad weather made the images useless. They found nothing. No parachute, no body, no money, no trace that anyone had jumped at all. I followed the news coverage obsessively. I kept thinking about the man at my counter, how ordinary he'd seemed, how I'd looked right at him and seen nothing unusual. The FBI released a sketch based on descriptions from the crew. It looked like him, but it also looked like 1,000 other middle-aged men. They investigated hundreds of suspects. None of them fit. The prevailing theory was that he died in the jump. He was wearing a business suit and loafers completely inappropriate for a parachute landing in a forest. The parachute he'd taken couldn't be steered. He'd jumped at night in a rainstorm into mountainous, heavily wooded terrain. The temperature at that altitude was well below freezing. Even if he survived the landing, hypothermia would have killed him within hours. But without a body, no one could be sure. I changed jobs in 1973, moved to a different city. I got married, had kids, built a life that had nothing to do with airline counters or hijackers. But I never forgot Dan Cooper. Every few years, there'd be a new story about a new suspect or a new theory, and I'd read it and remember his face at my counter. Then in 1980, something happened that brought it all back. A boy was playing on the banks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He was 8 years old, smoothing out sand to build a fire for a family camping trip. His hand hit something buried just inches below the surface. 3 packets of $20 bills, deteriorated and fragile, still bound with rubber bands. The serial numbers matched the ransom money. The discovery was about 20 miles from the suspected jump zone. The FBI couldn't explain how the money got there. If Cooper had landed near the river and buried it, why bury it so shallow? Why only 3 packets out of 10,000 bills? If he'd died in the jump, how did the money end up separated from his body? If the money washed downstream through smaller tributaries, where was the rest of it? They analyzed the bills for years. The way they were layered suggested they hadn't been submerged in water for very long. Maybe only a few months, not the full 9 years since the hijacking. But that created even more questions. Where had the money been for 8.5 years? In 2020, scientists examined diatoms, microscopic algae on the bills, and determined they probably didn't enter the water until spring 1972, several months after the hijacking. But that just deepened the mystery. What happened to the money in the meantime? The FBI investigated nearly 1,000 suspects over the years. Richard Floyd Jr. hijacked a plane just 5 months later using an almost identical method, but he didn't match the physical description. A man named Robert Rackstraw became a prime suspect in later years. He was a Vietnam veteran with parachute training and a criminal record, but he denied it until his death in 2019. In 2023, the children of Richard McCoy came forward with a parachute they'd found in their family's storage, reigniting speculation. But no one could prove anything. The FBI closed the case in 2016, saying they needed to focus resources elsewhere. Dan Cooper's true identity remains unknown. I'm retired now. I haven't worked an airline counter in over 40 years, but I still think about that day sometimes. About the man who paid cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle and changed the way Americans fly forever. After him, they started screening passengers and luggage. They modified Boeing 727s so the rear stairs couldn't be opened mid-flight. The whole industry changed because of what he did. What bothers me most is not knowing. Did he die in the jump? His body decomposing in some ravine where no one's ever looked? He was polite, soft-spoken, mid-40s, I'd guess. Dark hair, brown eyes. He wore a black business suit with a thin black tie and a white shirt. He looked like every other businessman I'd checked in that day. He wrote Dan Cooper on the ticket form. His handwriting was neat, careful. I asked if he had any luggage to check. He said no, just a briefcase. I handed him his boarding pass and wished him a good flight. I didn't think about him again until 2 days later when his face was on every television screen in the country. Flight 305 was a short hop Portland to Seattle, barely 30 minutes in the air. The Boeing 727 wasn't full. 36 passengers and a crew of 6. It was supposed to be routine. The kind of flight attendants could work in their sleep. Florence Schaffner was working the aft cabin. She told investigators later that the man in seat 18C seemed unremarkable. He ordered a bourbon and soda. He lit a cigarette. He was quiet, kept to himself. Then about 15 minutes into the flight, he handed her a note. She thought it was a phone number. Passengers hit on flight attendants all the time. She tucked it in her pocket without reading it and kept working. The man leaned toward her and spoke quietly. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She read it standing in the aisle. Later, she couldn't remember the exact wording, just the essential message. He had a bomb in his briefcase. He would use it if necessary. He wanted her to sit next to him. She sat. He opened the briefcase just enough for her to see inside red cylinders, wires, a battery. It looked real enough that she believed him. His demands were specific. $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, a fuel truck standing by when they landed in Seattle. He was calm when he said it, almost casual, like he was ordering room service. The pilot radioed SeaTac. I imagine the air traffic controllers thought it was a joke at first. Hijackings happen, sure, but not like this. Not with such precise demands, not with someone who sounded so calm. But the man had a bomb, or something that looked like a bomb, and 36 passengers. So they did what he asked. The plane circled Seattle for nearly 2 hours while the airlines scrambled to get the money. Banks had to open. Someone had to gather $200,000 in $20 bills. The FBI recorded every serial number. Someone drove it to the airport. Someone else found 4 parachutes, 2 primary chutes and 2 reserve chutes, like he'd specified. I heard about all this later, of course. At the time, I was home getting ready for Thanksgiving dinner, completely unaware that the polite man I'd checked in was holding a plane full of people hostage somewhere over Washington. The plane landed at SeaTac around 5:30 in the evening. The man allowed all the passengers to leave in exchange for the money and parachutes. The crew stayed pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant named Tina Mucklow. He ordered them to fly to Mexico City with a refueling stop in Reno. He had specific instructions about how they should fly, stay below 10,000 feet, keep the speed under 200 knots, landing gear down, flaps at 15 degrees, rear stairs deployed. The crew tried to explain that flying that way would burn too much fuel. They wouldn't make it to Mexico City. He didn't care. Just get to Reno, he said. They took off a little after 7:30. It was dark by then, raining. The wind was strong. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, while flying over the wilderness of southwest Washington, the man did something that still doesn't make sense to me even after all these years. He tied the bag of money to himself. He put on one of the parachutes. He sent Tina Mucklow to the cockpit and told her to close the door. Then he lowered the rear air stair and jumped out of the plane into the dark. I moved to Washington State in 2019 for work, software job in Seattle, decent pay, and I wanted to be closer to the mountains. I'd always been into hiking, nothing extreme, just day trips on weekends to clear my head. Mount Rainier was less than 2 hours from my apartment, and I made the drive almost every Saturday that first summer. Carbonado was a town I passed through a few times without really noticing it. Population maybe 600, probably less. I'd search for updates every few days. I'd read through forums where people speculated about what might have happened. I started keeping a folder on my computer with news articles and timelines. The theories ranged from reasonable to absurd. Some people thought the men had gone hiking and gotten lost. Others suggested suicide. A few pointed to the possibility of foul play, someone targeting men in that area. One forum user suggested the Carbon River itself was somehow responsible, that people were falling in and being swept away. But none of it explained why 3 men would park their cars in the same spot and then vanish without a trace. I drove back to Carbonado in June. I told myself I was going hiking in Mount Rainier, but I stopped at the Fairfax Bridge again. This time I brought a topographic map. I wanted to see what was actually out there, where someone might go if they left their car and walked into the forest. The trail I'd walked before didn't go far. It petered out after maybe half a mile into nothing but dense woods. There were no official hiking trails starting from that location. The nearest maintained trail was miles away inside the national park. So where did they go? I talked to someone at the gas station in Carbonado, an older woman behind the counter who'd probably lived there her whole life. I asked if she knew anything about the disappearances. She got quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Terrible thing," she said. 3 boys, all gone. They searched and searched, didn't find nothing. I asked if she had any theories about what might have happened. She looked at me for a long moment. "That bridge has always been unlucky," she said finally. "Even before all this, people have accidents there. Cars go off the road. It's just a bad spot." I asked what she meant by unlucky. She shrugged. "Some places are just like that. You live here long enough, you learn which places to avoid." I bought a coffee and left. The more I researched, the more disturbing details I found. Michael Fortenberry had experienced some kind of medical episode before he disappeared, something that caused delirium and confusion. His family wondered if he'd had another episode and wandered into the woods in a disoriented state. But Nathan Lerner had no such history. He was healthy, experienced outdoors, no indication he was suicidal or struggling with anything. He just parked his car and disappeared. And Austin Chase had been running from police. Whatever his reasons for that chase, his priority should have been getting away, not abandoning his vehicle and fleeing into the wilderness. None of it made sense individually. Together, it felt impossible. I started looking into Mount Rainier's disappearance statistics. The numbers were staggering. Since 1926, over 400 people had vanished in or around the park. Some were found eventually, many weren't. The Park Service attributed it to the dangerous terrain, unpredictable weather, and the vast size of the wilderness. But Mount Rainier's disappearance rate was significantly higher than other comparable national parks, almost 4 times higher than Yellowstone per visitor. And a disproportionate number of those disappearances happened in the northwest section of the park, the area closest to Carbonado. I found myself driving to the Fairfax Bridge every few weeks. I never had a good reason for it. I'd park in the same pullout, walk across the bridge, look into the trees. Sometimes I'd walk down that trail again, never going very far, always feeling like I was being watched, even though I never saw anyone. In August, I brought a friend with me. I told him I wanted to do some hiking in the area, needed someone to come along for safety. We drove to Carbonado, parked near the bridge. I showed him the trailhead. "Where does this go?" he asked. "Nowhere," I said. "That's the weird part. It doesn't go anywhere." We walked it together. He noticed the same thing I had. The trail just ended. There were no markers, no signs it had ever been maintained. It was just a path that led into the woods and stopped. "Maybe it's an old logging road," he said, "or a game trail that people started using." That made sense. But it didn't explain why 3 men would park at the bridge and walk down it. We drove into Mount Rainier proper after that, did actual hike on a maintained trail. My friend never asked why I'd really brought him to Carbonado, and I didn't explain. On the drive home, he mentioned he'd felt uneasy near the bridge, said the whole area had a weird vibe to it. I knew exactly what he meant. The last time I drove to the Fairfax Bridge was in October 2021, a year after Michael Fortenberry had disappeared. The leaves were changing, and the forest looked different in the fall, lightless, oppressive, almost beautiful. I parked and walked across the bridge again. The Carbon River moved below, the same as it always had. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, trying to understand what I was looking for, trying to understand why I kept coming back. One of those places that exists because it used to be something, a mining town back when coal was king. Now it's just a handful of streets and a gas station on the way to the northwest entrance of Mount Rainier National Park. The Fairfax Bridge crosses the Carbon River just outside town. It's not much to look at, old, narrow, the kind of bridge you drive over without thinking about it. I probably crossed it a dozen times before I ever paid attention to it. 3 men had stood somewhere near this spot. 3 men had left their vehicles and walked into those woods. 3 men had never come out, and no one knew why. I haven't been back since. I moved to Portland for a different job in early 2022, and I told myself I was glad to leave that part of Washington behind. But I still check the news sometimes, searching for updates on the Carbonado cases, hoping someone found something, hoping there's an explanation that makes sense. There never is. The families are still looking. Michael Fortenberry's mother still posts on social media asking anyone with information to come forward. Nathan Lerner's name appears on missing persons databases with the same details. Last seen near Carbonado, no leads, investigation ongoing. Austin Chase's children are growing up without knowing what happened to their father. And the Fairfax Bridge is still there, crossing the Carbon River just outside a town of 600 people who've learned to avoid talking about what happened. Sometimes I think about the woman at the gas station. How she said some places are just unlucky. How people who live there long enough learn which places to avoid. I think about the forest pressing in on both sides of that bridge. How quiet it was when I walked that trail. How it felt like something was watching even though nothing was there. I think about 3 men, all roughly the same age, all disappearing from the same location within 13 months. About how statistically impossible that should be. And I think about Mount Rainier, looming in the distance, beautiful and deadly, with over 400 people lost in its shadow since 1926. The wilderness doesn't need a reason to take people. It doesn't need a pattern or a purpose. Sometimes people just walk into the woods and don't come back. But 3 men in 13 months, all from the same bridge in a town of 600, that's not the wilderness. That's something else. I don't know what happened at the Fairfax Bridge. I don't know where Michael Fortenberry and Nathan Lerner and Austin Chase went after they left their vehicles. I don't know if they're still out there in those woods, or if the Carbon River took them, or if something worse happened. What I know is that I'm glad I don't live near Carbonado anymore, that I don't drive past that bridge on my way to the mountains, that I don't have to see that trailhead that leads nowhere and wonder what's at the end of it. Some questions don't have answers. Some places don't give up their secrets. The Fairfax Bridge is one of them. The first time I heard about the disappearances was in October 2020. I was having coffee with a coworker who was into true crime podcasts, and she mentioned something about a guy who'd gone missing near Mount Rainier. His car had been found abandoned near some bridge in Carbonado. They searched for weeks, she said. Never found anything. It's like he just walked into the woods and disappeared. I asked her what bridge. She couldn't remember the name. I didn't think much about it at the time. People go missing in national parks. The wilderness is dangerous. It happens. Then in April 2021, I was planning a hike and checking the Mount Rainier forums online. Someone had posted asking if anyone had information about a missing hiker named Nathan Lerner. 30 years old, last seen in the Carbonado area. His car had been found near the Fairfax Bridge. The Fairfax Bridge. I recognized the name now, the same bridge from the story my coworker had told me. I started searching. It didn't take long to find the details. Michael Fortenberry had disappeared in October 2020. His car was found abandoned near the Fairfax Bridge. 6 months later, Nathan Lerner's vehicle was discovered in almost the exact same location. Both men in their 30s. Both vehicles left near the same bridge. Neither man ever found. I told myself it was a coincidence. Carbonado was a gateway to Mount Rainier. People parked there to hike. Sometimes hikers got lost or injured. The terrain was difficult, dense forest, steep ravines, the Carbon River running fast and cold. It made sense that someone could disappear out there. But 2 men in 6 months? In a town of 600 people? A week later, I drove to Carbonado. I'm not sure why. Curiosity, maybe. Or the uncomfortable feeling that comes from learning about something terrible happening in a place you've driven through without knowing. The Fairfax Bridge looked the same as it always had. I parked in a pullout nearby and walked across it. The Carbon River moved below, wide and dark. The forest pressed in on both sides, thick stands of Douglas fir and cedar. The underbrush so dense you couldn't see more than a few feet into the trees. There was a trailhead nearby, not an official one, just a path that led into the woods. I walked maybe 50 yards down it before I stopped. The forest was quiet, too quiet, in that way that makes you suddenly aware of how alone you are. I turned around and went back to my car. On May 7th, 2021, less than 3 weeks after I'd made that drive, there was a police chase. A silver Ford Escape was being pursued by Buckley police. The chase ended when the vehicle went over the Fairfax Bridge. When rescue crews reached the crashed car, the driver was gone. The vehicle belonged to Austin Chase, 36 years old, father of 3, from Waller, Washington. He'd been driving the car. Now he wasn't in it, and there was no sign of where he'd gone. 3 men, 30 to 36 years old, all disappeared from the same location within 13 months. The news coverage was minimal. Local stations ran the stories for a few days, then moved on. The searches were organized, then scaled back, then quietly stopped. The families kept looking, kept posting on social media, kept asking for information. But as weeks turned into months with no new developments, even those posts became less frequent. I became obsessed with it in a way I'm not proud of. I worked at Paradise Inn on Mount Rainier for 3 summers during college. It's one of those historic lodges that looks exactly like what you picture: massive timber beams, stone fireplaces, built in 1917 when they thought buildings should last forever. It sits at 5,400 feet elevation, and on clear days you can see the summit of Rainier so close it doesn't seem real. My first season was 2013. I was 20 and needed summer work that came with housing. Footsteps on the floor above me, doors closing. Once I heard what sounded like someone moving furniture, dragging something heavy across the floor. I called up to the room the sound was coming from. A guest answered, groggy and annoyed. No, he hadn't been moving anything. Yes, he was trying to sleep. I stopped calling after that. Just logged the incidents in my mental file of things I couldn't explain and didn't want to think about too hard. It was that summer that I learned more about Sheila. One of the older seasonal employees, a woman named Linda who'd been coming back for over 20 years, knew her. They'd worked together briefly. She loved this place, Linda told me one afternoon. We were having coffee in the employee lounge, rain drumming against the windows. She was so excited when she got the winter position. I remember her at the end of season party talking about how beautiful it would be up here with snow. I asked Linda what she thought happened. She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Sheila wasn't the type to put herself in danger. She was careful, smart. Whatever happened to her, I don't think she saw it coming. Linda said the hardest part was not knowing, not having answers. For a long time, people thought maybe she just left. Decided not to take the winter job and didn't tell anyone. But that wasn't like her. And then when they found her remains, she trailed off, staring into her coffee. I asked if Linda thought the inn was haunted. She looked at me carefully. I think some places hold on to things, bad things that happened. I think Paradise remembers. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about Sheila. About her remains scattered across 300 yards, about how excited she'd been for the winter job, about how something or someone had taken that from her. The incidents of the inn seemed to increase that summer, more guests complaining about noises, more unexplained electrical issues. One morning I came into work and found that all the furniture in the lobby had been rearranged overnight. The heavy armchairs, the tables, everything shifted into different positions. Tom swore he'd locked all the doors. There was no sign of a break-in. We rearranged everything back and didn't talk about it. My third summer, 2015, I almost didn't come back. But the money was good and I'd made friends, so I returned. This time I requested day shifts only. I told my supervisor it was because I wanted to hike more in the evenings. Really, I just didn't want to be in the inn alone at night anymore. That summer, a hiker went missing. Dr. Sam Duvall, 33 years old. He was doing a solo overnight trip on the Mother Mountain Loop Trail. He had all the right gear, plenty of experience. He was supposed to return on October 10th. He never did. The search was massive. 9 days, 50 people at its peak. Helicopters, Air Force personnel, volunteer search teams. They covered everything within miles of his last known location. They found nothing. I followed the search closely, more closely than I probably should have. I kept thinking about the statistics. I'd read over 400 people missing from Mount Rainier since 1926, the highest disappearance rate of any comparable national park. What was it about this mountain that took so many people? The other employees and I would talk about it during breaks. Everyone had theories. The terrain was dangerous, the weather unpredictable. People underestimated the wilderness. Accidents happened, but 400 people? That wasn't accidents. That was something else. I started researching the mountain's history. The disappearances went back decades. Experienced hikers vanishing on trails they knew well. People in bright clothing never being seen again. Entire search parties finding nothing despite covering every inch of the area where someone should have been. There was Karen Sykes in 2014. 70 years old, veteran outdoor writer, had written guidebooks about Mount Rainier's trails. She'd hiked the Owehigh Lakes Trail 37 times. She disappeared on her 38th hike and was later found far from where she should have been. The medical examiner couldn't explain why someone with her experience would have deviated so far from the trail. There were the 3 people who vanished in 8 days during June 2020. Vincent G., Talal Sabahu, Matthew Bunker, all experienced, all prepared, all gone. The pattern was impossible to ignore once you saw it. People didn't just die on Mount Rainier. They vanished completely, as if the mountain itself had swallowed them. I started having dreams that summer, always the same one. I'd be hiking alone on a trail I knew, and I'd realize I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. I'd turn around and the trail would be gone. Just forest in every direction, dense and dark. And I'd know with absolute certainty that I was never going to find my way out. I'd wake up breathing hard, my roommate asking if I was okay. Paradise Inn hired a small crew each year housekeeping. Front desk, kitchen staff, maintenance. Maybe 30 of us total living in employee housing behind the main building. It was good work if you didn't mind isolation. The nearest town was an hour away and cell service was non-existent. I liked it, mostly. The guests were generally pleasant, the scenery was incredible, and my coworkers became close friends quickly the way people do when they're living and working in the same isolated place. I was not okay. The thing that haunted me most wasn't the disappearances themselves. It was how they happened. People would be hiking with friends, step off the trail for just a moment and never be seen again. Or they'd be on a well-marked path in good weather and somehow end up miles away in terrain that made no sense for them to have reached. It was like the mountain was playing with them, leading them somewhere they didn't want to go. I left Paradise Inn in September 2015 and didn't go back. I told people I graduated and needed to start my career, which was true. But the real reason was that I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was hungry, that it took people not randomly but deliberately, that working there was like living in the mouth of something vast and patient. I still think about Sheila Kearns sometimes, about how excited she was for the winter job, about how her remains were scattered across 300 yards of the Longmire campground, about how no one was ever arrested or charged. I think about the guests who heard footsteps in empty hallways, about the furniture that moved itself overnight, about Linda saying some places hold on to bad things. I think about Dr. Sam Dubal, who had everything he needed to survive and still disappeared without a trace. I think about Mount Rainier, beautiful and deadly, with 412 people lost in its shadow. And I think about Paradise Inn, sitting at 5,400 feet, welcoming guests every summer like nothing's wrong, like people haven't vanished from its trails, like Sheila Kearns wasn't murdered somewhere nearby and the person who did it was never found. The inn is still operating. They still hire seasonal employees every year. People still hike the trails and take photos of the summit and talk about how beautiful and majestic the mountain is, and people still disappear. Not every year, not in numbers that would close the park or stop tourism, just enough to maintain the statistics. Just enough to keep Mount Rainier's disappearance rate 4 times higher than comparable parks. Just enough to make you wonder if the mountain is something more than rock and ice and forest. I don't hike much anymore. When friends suggest trips to Mount Rainier, I make excuses. I can't explain to them why I won't go back without sounding paranoid or unhinged. How do you tell someone that you think a mountain is alive? Bet it watches and waits and takes people when it wants them? Bet Paradise Inn isn't haunted by a ghost but by the mountain itself, by all the people it's swallowed over the decades? You don't. You just say you're busy. You have other plans. Maybe next time. And you hope they're careful. You hope they stay on the marked trails and don't wander off alone and trust their instincts when something feels wrong. You hope the mountain lets them leave, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people walk into those woods and become part of the 412. Part of the statistics, part of the mountain. And Paradise Inn keeps welcoming guests, and the trails stay open. And Mount Rainier waits, beautiful and patient, for the next person who underestimates what it is. I'm glad I left when I did. I'm glad I'm not there anymore. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about the forests around Paradise, about the trails I used to hike, about the silence in those woods that felt too complete. And I wonder who's walking there now. I wonder if they'll make it back. We'd hike on our days off, sit around the fire pit at night, drive down to Ashford for supplies once a week. It was during one of those evening conversations that I first heard about Sheila Kearns. We were sitting outside employee housing, maybe 6 of us, and someone mentioned that Paradise Inn was supposedly haunted. I laughed it off. Every old building claims to be haunted, but Maya, who was in her 3rd season, said no, this was different. A woman who worked here disappeared in 1996, she said. They found her body 7 months later. Murdered. They never caught whoever did it. The conversation got quiet. I asked what happened. Maya didn't know all the details, just what she'd heard from other employees over the years. The woman's name was Sheila Kearns. She'd worked at Paradise Inn and was excited about staying on for the winter crew. The inn closed for the season in early October, and somewhere between closing and when she was supposed to start the winter job, she vanished. Her remains were found scattered in the Longmire campground area the following spring. Scattered how? Someone asked. Like animals had gotten to her, Maya said. But the police thought it was foul play. They just couldn't prove anything. I asked if they had any suspects. Maya shrugged. Not that I ever heard. It's still an open case with the FBI because it happened in a national park. That night, I looked Sheila up on my laptop, using the slow employee Wi-Fi. There wasn't much information, a few news articles from 1996 and 1997, a mention on a missing persons database. She'd been 43. The articles described her as well-liked, happy about the winter position. Then, she was gone. I thought about it more than I should have over the next few weeks. When I walked past the Longmire area on hikes, I'd think about her remains being found there. When I passed through the inn's long corridors at night, I'd wonder if she'd walk those same halls. The thing about working at Paradise Inn is that you're always aware of how isolated you are. During the day with guests around, it feels safe and normal. But at night, when the inn is mostly empty and you're walking back to employee housing in the dark, you feel how alone you actually are. The nearest help is miles away. The forest presses in on all sides. If something happened, no one would know for hours, maybe days. I started noticing other things that summer. Guests would mention strange sounds in their rooms, footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, doors opening and closing. One couple asked to change rooms because they kept hearing someone walking around above them, but their room was on the top floor. Nothing above it but the roof. The maintenance guy, Tom, mentioned once that lights in certain rooms would turn on and off by themselves. He checked the wiring and find nothing wrong. He'd been working at the inn for 15 years and said it happened every season. Old building, he said. Things settle weird. Electrical gets funky. But he didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. My second summer, 2014, I got moved to front desk. It meant working nights sometimes, sitting alone in the lobby while guests slept upstairs. The lobby was beautiful during the day, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, the massive fireplace, the timber beams overhead. At night it felt different, bigger. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be. I'd hear things sometimes during those night shifts.